She pleaded for work holding her baby. The cowboy looked once and said, "You're home." The blizzard did not fall. It hunted. Snow knifed sideways across the Montana prairie, swallowing the last line of dusk as Eliza Thornton bent into it, her infant, Samuel, bound to her chest beneath a stiff frozen shawl. His breath fluttered against her collarbone, then faltered. One thin failing moth. She counted heartbeats to keep panic from breaking her stride. The wind shrieked through cottonwoods like a warning, and the world narrowed to white and ache and the drum of her boots dragging free from drifts that tried to claim them. Somewhere behind her, a wolf gave a single clipped bark, too close, too curious. She didn't turn, she couldn't. She whispered names into Samuel's knit cap. His, hers, the mother she'd lost. The God she wasn't sure still listened. Until a pinprick of lantern light winked through the storm, then vanished, then returned as if someone were signaling, as if someone already knew she was coming. Hope struck hot and with it dread. Why would anyone beckon a stranger in a night like this? She angled toward the glow, legs trembling, skirt hardened with ice, and crested a low rise where the wind knuckled her sideways. Below, a squat cabin crouched behind a split rail fence half buried in white. Fresh axe cuts scarred a stump by the door and a length of rope swung empty, like a noose above a bucket. Eliza mounted the theft, the iron rings seared through her damp glove. The sound died instantly, swallowed by the howl. Seconds stretched. Behind the door a floorboard creaked. Another lantern flared in the window to her right, then dropped out of sight as if someone had stepped away fast. The latch lifted. The door opened onto a tall figure rimmed in lamplight, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He looked at the baby first, then her. His voice came quiet, certain, and wrong in the wild night. "You're home." What he meant by home and why he'd been waiting will upend everything you expect next. Warm air and wood smoke met Eliza as the door yielded, a hush of heat that felt almost impossible after the white roar outside. She stepped in with Samuel clutched close. Visions stinging while lamplight drew edges around a spare room. A stone hearth working. A plank table scarred by meals. Two narrow bunks, pegs holding a hat. A canvas slicker. A wool coat crusted with frost. Boots weighted by the threshold like sentries off duty. A coil of rope slept beneath them. On the iron arm above the fire a blue kettle breathed. Resin cracked in the split pine, sending small sparks upward to vanish in soot. The man closed the door with care, as though any hard motion might shatter what warmth existed. Then took off his hat and hung it on a peg. He was tall without effort, shoulders squared by work rather than pride, jaw rough with a few days' growth, eyes gray and steady under the brim's shadow. "Caleb Ward," he said, voice low, the name offered like a tool. Eliza nodded, but did not yet trust speech. Words felt brittle after the wind's sandpaper. She shifted Samuel under her shawl until his cheek found the place where her collarbone held the last of her heat. Caleb moved without comment to a cedar chest at the foot of the bunks, lifted the lid and drew out a gray blanket, soft with age. He opened it toward her, not reaching, only letting space fill with permission. She took the wool, wrapped the baby first, then herself, and felt the trembling in her forearms slow. "Please," she managed, the syllables scraping together. "Shelter for tonight. I can work, cook, clean, mend. Only let us stay." He stoked the fire with 2 measured thrusts, set a fresh log crosswise, then hooked the kettle closer to the flame. "Heat comes slow," he said, not looking straight at her, "and you've had more cold than a person ought." Snow hissed against the panes, shouldering higher along the sill until the lower half of the window gave up the world outside. Wind found the chinks and breathed through in thin threads that cooled her boot. Inside, the cabin arranged itself into a kind of order that steadied her. The table square to the hearth, the chairs drawn true, a shelf with a Bible, a whetstone, a folded map curling at the corners. Life set out plain, nothing extra, nothing careless. Caleb ladled broth from a blackened pot, let the cup rest a moment by the fire until steam softened, then carried it to her with both hands, careful as if the tin were fine china. She drank by small swallows and felt warmth climb, a slow river running inside her bone. Samuel's breath, earlier a thin gasp, deepened against her skin. "There's bread," Caleb said, cutting a heel from a wrapped loaf and placing it near the cup. "Thank you," she said, the phrase too small for the moment, yet the only one available. He inclined his head as if to say gratitude had been heard and filed, not required. Eliza's gaze traveled because curiosity calms fear. On the shelf a leather notebook lay strapped shut. Beside it a dulled tin star and a length of blue ribbon folded many times. None of those things announced their story, yet together they hinted at a history that had learned silence. She kept her questions in her mouth like seeds in winter. "Work," she said after a time, because offering balm felt safer than asking for mercy. "If Dawn allows, I'll take on chore. I won't be a burden." "Eat first," he answered. Courage spends itself quickly on an empty belly. He poured coffee into a dented mug, then a second, set one before her and sat opposite with both boots planted like anchors. In the light his hands looked nicked and strong, a map of labor. A faint scar curved from the base of his thumb toward the wrist and disappeared under the cuff. Nothing in his posture suggested danger, only restraint. Outside, snow pulled itself higher, drifts leaning into the logs, the storm turning the cabin into an island that floated in noise. The thought of being sealed in might have frightened her on any other night. Now the idea that the weather would force stillness felt like permission to breathe. She loosened the shawl just enough to see Samuel's cheeks recover color, kissed the soft place above his ear, then tucked him again. "Where were you headed?" Caleb asked, almost as an afterthought, before the wind made other plans. "Farther than sense," she said, and left it there. He accepted the boundary without pressure. They ate in small motions, the kind that keep talk from breaking what caution has built. Caleb rose to add wood and adjusted the draft. The fire answered with a brighter voice. The map's edge curled tighter in the heat. Eliza imagined a creek under ice, cottonwoods glazed, a horse stepping carefully on rime along a fence line. Thoughts wandered toward daylight chores and found comfort in imagining tasks. Sweeping, splitting kindling, cooking something that did not taste like fear. She tested the chair legs and felt them hold. The cabin's plainness began to read as care. Tools hung straight, floors swept, a kettle wiped clean along the rim even when no company would see it. A man who leaves things orderly leaves room for other lives to rest. Caleb fetched a small basin, filled it from the kettle and set it on a stool by her knee. "For your hands," takes the sting out. She dipped a cloth and cleaned Samuel's brow, then hers, letting warm damp push back the grit left by blown ice. He turned away just enough to grant privacy without making a ceremony of it. "If you allow," she said, "I can patch that sleeve tomorrow." She nodded at a seam near his elbow where threads had frayed. "Tomorrow works," he replied. "Stitches run truer after His answer carried more than cloth and she heard it. Wind shoved at the door, the latch rattled, settled, rattled again like a heartbeat in wood. Eliza realized she trusted the sound more than the quiet now. As long as it kept speaking they were inside and the storm was not. She thought of the road behind, of faces that had turned away when need approached, and felt the inward shiver that follows closing gates. Here, a stranger had opened, then stepped back to make space instead of filling it with questions. If anyone listening has ever crossed a threshold with fear stacked on both shoulders, think of the moment your lungs recognized warmth again, and the person whose steadiness gave you that breath. Caleb lifted his mug, drank and set it down with the soft tap of a man who avoids needless noise. "Pass will close by morning," he said. "You'll be snowed in a spell, then a spell is what we'll live through," she answered, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. The reply raised one corner of his mouth before it vanished like a bird on a fence. The fire held. Warm air and wood smoke met Eliza as the door yielded, a hush of heat that felt almost impossible after the white roar outside. She stepped in with Samuel clutched close, vision stinging while lamplight drew edges around a spare room, a stone hearth working, a plank table scarred by meals, two narrow bunks, pegs holding a hat, a canvas slicker, a wool coat crusted with frost, boots weighted by the threshold like sentries off duty, a coil of rope slept beneath them. On the iron arm above the fire a blue kettle breathed, resin cracked in the split pine sending small sparks upward to vanish in soot. The man closed the door with care, as though any hard motion might shatter what warmth existed, then took off his hat and hung it on a peg. He was tall without effort, shoulders squared by work rather than pride, jaw rough with a few days' growth, eyes gray and steady under the brim's shadow. "Caleb Ward," he said, voice low, The name offered like a tool. Eliza nodded but did not yet trust speech. Words felt brittle after the wind's sandpaper. She shifted Samuel under her shawl until his cheek found the place where her collarbone held the last of her heat. Caleb moved without comment to a cedar chest at the foot of the bunks, lifted the lid and drew out a gray blanket, soft with age. He opened it toward her, not reaching, only letting space fill with permission. She took the wool, wrapped the baby first, then herself, and felt the trembling in her forearms slow. Please, she managed, the syllables scraping together. Shelter for tonight. I can work, cook, clean, mend. Only let us. He stoked the fire with 2 measured thrusts, set a fresh log crosswise, then hooked the kettle closer to the flame. Heat comes slow, he said, not looking straight at her. And you've had more cold than a person. Snow hissed against the panes, shouldering higher along the sill until the lower half of the window gave up the world outside. Wind found the chinks and breathed through in thin threads that cooled her boots. Inside, the cabin arranged itself into a kind of order that steadied her. The table square to the hearth, the chairs drawn true, a shelf with a Bible, a whetstone, a folded map curling at the corners. Life set out plain, nothing extra, nothing careless. Caleb ladled broth from a blackened pot, let the cup rest a moment by the fire until steam softened, then carried it to her with both hands, careful as if the tin were fine china. She drank by small swallows and felt warmth climb, a slow river running inside her bones. Samuel's breath, earlier a thin gasp, deepened against her skin. There's bread, Caleb said, cutting a heel from a wrapped loaf and placing it near the cup. Thank you, she said, the phrase too small for the moment, yet the only one available. He inclined his head as if to say gratitude had been heard and filed, not required. Eliza's gaze traveled because curiosity calms fear. On the shelf a leather notebook lay strapped shut. Beside it, a dulled tin star and a length of blue ribbon folded many times. None of those things announced their story, yet together they hinted at a history that had learned silence. She kept her questions in her mouth like seeds in winter. Work, she said after a time, because offering balm felt safer than asking for mercy. If Dawn allows, I'll take on chores. I won't be a burden. Eat first, he answered. Courage spends itself quickly on an empty belly. He poured coffee into a dented mug, then a second, set one before her, and sat opposite with both boots planted like anchors. In the light his hands looked nicked and strong, a map of labor. A faint scar curved from the base of his thumb toward the wrist and disappeared under the cuff. Nothing in his posture suggested danger, only restraint. Outside, snow pulled itself higher, drifts leaning into the logs, the storm turning the cabin into an island that floated in noise. The thought of being sealed in might have frightened her on any other night. Now the idea that the weather would force stillness felt like permission to breathe. She loosened the shawl just enough to see Samuel's cheeks recover color, kissed the soft place above his ear, then tucked him again. Where were you headed? Caleb asked, almost as an afterthought, before the wind made other plans. Farther than sense, she said, and left it there. He accepted the boundary without pressure. They ate in small motions, the kind that keep talk from breaking what caution has built. Caleb rose to add wood and adjusted the draft. The fire answered with a brighter voice. The map's edge curled tighter in the heat. Eliza imagined a creek under ice, cottonwoods glazed, a horse stepping carefully on rime along a fence line. Thoughts wandered toward daylight chores and found comfort in imagining tasks, sweeping, splitting kindling, cooking something that did not taste like fear. She tested the chair legs and felt them hold. The cabin's plainness began to read as care. Tools hung straight, floors swept, a kettle wiped clean along the rim even when no company would see it. A man who leaves things orderly, leaves room for other lives to rest. Caleb fetched a small basin, filled it from the kettle, and set it on a stool by her knee. For your hands, takes the sting out. She dipped a cloth and cleaned Samuel's brow, then hers, letting warm damp push back the grit left by blown ice. He turned away just enough to grant privacy without making a ceremony of it. If you allow, she said, I can patch that sleeve tomorrow. She nodded at a seam near his elbow where threads had frayed. Tomorrow works, he replied. Stitches run truer after rest. His answer carried more than cloth, and she heard it. Wind shoved at the door. The latch rattled, settled, rattled again like a heartbeat in wood. Eliza realized she trusted the sound more than the quiet now. As long as it kept speaking, they were inside and the storm was. She thought of the road behind, of faces that had turned away when need approached, and felt the inward shiver that follows closing gates. Here a stranger had opened, then stepped back to make space instead of filling it with questions. If anyone listening has ever crossed a threshold with fear stacked on both shoulders, think of the moment your lungs recognized warmth again, and the person whose steadiness gave you that breath. Caleb lifted his mug, drank and set it down with the soft tap of a man who avoids needless noise. Pass will close by morning, he said. You'll be snowed in a spell. Then a spell is what we'll live through, she answered, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. The reply raised one corner of his mouth, before it vanished like a bird on a fence. The fire. Morning came thin and colorless, as if the storm had scrubbed the world to bone. Eliza woke with Samuel warm against her, the hearth murmuring, the cabin answering the weather with gentle creaks. Caleb had risen before dawn. The kettle breathed, split pines snapped as resin let go. His sounds were spare and practiced. A wet stone whispering along steel, a hinge set down softly. The door lifted against the drift and eased shut to keep heat in. She laid the child in the nearer bunk, ringed him with a rolled blanket, tied her hair back, and took stock. Flour, salt, a bit of lard, a jar of beans, cornmeal and the heel of bread made a meager ledger, enough to turn labor into breakfast. She set beans to simmer, mashed a portion with broth, pressed patties onto a hot skillet, and watched the edges brown. Coffee rose bitter and brave. Caleb stepped in on a ribbon of cold snow stitched to his coat hem and glove seams. He stamped once, shook his hat outside, and hung it on its peg. Morning, he said plain and low. She passed him a plate and a tin cup. He ate standing, glance moving from the sleeping child to the hinge he had carried in, measuring both with the same steady attention. A file rasped. He worked until the metal bit clean. Day refused to brighten. Fine flakes moved sideways past the window, glittering briefly before dissolving into the general white. The wind pressed. Less savage now, more insistent, like a hand on the shoulder that would not lift. Eliza scrubbed the skillet, dried it over flame, and set it back at the same angle. Order steadied her. She swept melt from the threshold, aired the child's blanket by the gentle side of the fire, rinsed cups with hot water to spare wood, and mended a sock with thread tugged from a frayed seam. Caleb repaired a shovel, drove a new wedge, tapped the grain true, then oiled a bridle until leather remembered softness. His movements wasted nothing. He was a man companioned by silence, yet the quiet he made felt like shelter rather than absence. At midday, she baked corn cakes, brushed them with broth, and shaved an onion so fine it flavored everything without surrendering itself. He washed his plate and set it to dry. Hours lengthened under low light. She sorted sprouted potatoes, saved what could be saved, and stacked the rest for planting when the world softened. He worked reins over his knee, then stepped out to the shed. Through the window she saw drifts erase the path to the corral, fence posts stuck up like black ribs in a rolling field. The wind sang a thin sawtooth song along the eaves. When he came back, a pale crust glittered on his beard. She noticed again the iron-bound trunk under the far bunk, a polished padlock bright where hands had worn it smooth. Dust never settled on its lid. A navy scarf lay folded on top, edge faintly singed, as if a arc had once kissed it and lingered. She let her gaze pass. Some doors you do not open without being asked. Samuel woke hungry. She fed him by the hearth, his small hands kneading her sleeve. Tiny clouds of warmth rose when he cooed. She kissed his hair and breathed milk. Smoke and the clean scent of snow boiled into water. Caleb came back with a box of irons, crouched to mend a warped spring, and placed each piece with the accuracy of someone who believes mislaid things can cost a lot. She stretched dough from the last of the flour, baked it flat, and watched brown freckles bloom like stars thawing through cloud. At the window a white fox trotted past, tail lifted, its track erased in a breath by a side gust. The sight pricked her with the old suspicion that the land kept messages, yet she pocketed the thought and returned to work. Caleb's mouth changed by a fraction when his glance brushed the scarf. He did not touch it. They ate in the hush that follows honest work. Snow stacked higher. The window narrowed to a pale square. A drift leaned into the door. The latch resisted. He barred it and tied a rope as if the storm might reach in like a determined hand. Evening drew the room small. Lamplight turned the logs honey dark. Eliza turned the blanket's torn edge under twice and stitched it tight. Caleb sorted nails into a tobacco tin, lined them by size, wiped the knife, cleaned the file and slid both into a tied roll. Each tool returned to its home, a habit that looked like prayer. Two lives moved side by side like sled tracks, close, parallel, not yet crossing. She stirred the pot and listened to slow bubbles climb. The child slept again, mouth round, lashes gold in firelight. A pause caught Caleb when his hand almost reached for the trunk. His jaw set then eased. He turned back to the fire without a word. Later, while he shaved curls for morning kindling, she noticed a folded scrap tucked behind the Bible's backboard, the paper's edge frayed by many removals and returns. Beside it the dull tin star and the blue ribbon lay quiet, ordinary until you looked long enough to feel past their surfaces. Whatever story breathed through those things did so the way smoke breathes through chinks. Faint, steady, inescapable. Night closed early. The wind found seams and spoke through them. She banked the fire, drew the kettle aside, tucked the child safe with a rolled quilt at the bunk's edge, and unwrapped her feet. Caleb passed her a strip of linen. "For your heels," he said. She warmed it and thanked him. He tipped his head, acknowledgement without ceremony. Sleep came in layers. When she rose to feed the coals, the room held that hour when every sound confesses itself. The pop of settling ember, the child's soft sigh, the faint tick as a nail resettled in its tin. Caleb lay on his bunk with an arm folded under his head, eyes on the rafters. She thought he was only awake by habit. Then his gaze slid to the trunk, caught on the scorched edge of the scarf, and held there as if the past had hooked him by the collar. She pretended not to see. Some griefs cannot bear an audience. Morning returned gray. Snow sealed the lower door and stacked like layered slate along the window. Caleb levered the bar, carved a trench with the mended shovel, and threw white in clean sheets until the threshold breathed. Eliza cooked porridge from the remaining cornmeal, sweetened with 2 raisins hiding at the jar's bottom, and let the child eat first. He smiled, proof against despair. She swept the ash shelf and found, tucked under the hearthstone's lip, a hand-forged hook hammered flat on one end. Broken things had been taught to stay useful here. Caleb set a pair of traps to dry, touched the lock lightly as if testing the weight of silence, then turned away and began to fletch a shortened arrow with feathers saved from a grouse. Patience made the work into a prayer that would never call itself one. By afternoon the wind shifted north, the air sharpening until inside noses stung. A thin sun slid along the cloud's edge and turned the prairie silver for a breath before it dulled again. Eliza strung a line above the hearth, pinned swaddles there, and watched steam rise in pale ropes. She made a thin stew from beans and potatoes, and a strip from the bone he had saved. The scent promised what it could keep. They ate more slowly, sipped coffee, and traded small glances that admitted a joined undertaking before speech would. After, he stood in the doorway to read the sky, as if it kept time. The scarf did not move. The trunk did not tell. Whatever loss had put ash on that cloth and a lock on that wood belonged to him and the wind. If you listening, have ever kept a story folded in your pocket until the edges wore thin, consider what it cost to hold it, and how you learned to walk and work with that weight without saying its name. Night gathered again. Eliza banked the fire, tucked the child in, and lay with her palms under her cheek, muscles tingling with the clean ache of usefulness. Caleb sat a while longer, tools quiet in their places, door barred against the weather, gaze finding the scarf once more. He did not move toward it. He only breathed, and the cabin and the winter beyond breathed with him. Outside, the wind wrote its long signature across the snow and kept going without pause. Dawn came pewter over the drifts, flattening ridges, until pasture and sky looked pressed from one dull sheet. And Eliza used that hush to carry scraps to the bin and shake ice from a saddle blanket, while Samuel slept by the hearth. Wind had veered in the night, carving dunes that piled against the corral rails, so she followed the trench Caleb had cut at first light, breath unwinding. Frost filmed the latch. She lifted it and eased inside, a push of snow following her heel until the door thudded shut. The barn smelled of hay, leather, iron chill and pine pitch. Dust halos floated where a knothole admitted morning. She meant to set the bucket down and leave, certain Caleb would be at the woodpile or bent over a hinge. Then a boot scraped, followed by the hush of someone stopping short to wrestle feeling back into its pen. Eliza stilled between stalls, eyes adjusting. Caleb stood near the rear wall where a shelf held a lantern. a coil of rawhide and a cedar box scarred by use. His back had a set she had not seen, like a man who has lifted one burden too many and now holds very still to keep from dropping them all. In his hands lay the navy scarf from the bunk, char seared along one edge. Under rough light, the damage showed worse, a lick of black that ate wool in a narrow crescent. He did not wrap it or press it to his face. He held it out, measuring distances the eye cannot see. A hinge gave a tiny complaint. Caleb's head turned slightly, not enough to catch her tucked in shadow, enough to prove he had heard the barn breathe. His gaze settled on the scarf, then downward, where dust had gathered in an oval between his boots. His voice came barely above air, raw the way a parent sounds at the end of a long night when love keeps moving, though the body begs to quit. Elliot. He said the name once, then again softer, as if the syllables might break. Something in Eliza loosened, not curiosity, not fear, only recognition, that ache you feel when a guarded soul lets its hold slip and you glimpse the wound stitched alone. She kept still and let him have privacy inside his grief, even while she remained, because leaving would make noise, and words were not required. He folded the scarf carefully, aligning the burned edge, so the damage formed a line rather than a ragged mouth, then brought it to his chest with both hands, chin lowered. His shoulders did not shake. They did something smaller, a brief unsettled settling, control holding, then yielding, then holding again. I should have been there, he breathed, ground down to a thread no one was meant to hear. He set the scarf atop the cedar box and opened the lid. Inside lay a narrow stack of papers tied with twine, a dull tin star and a fragment of blue ribbon folded so many times the crease remembered its shape. He did not touch the star, he did not unfold the ribbon. He lifted one paper, looked, returned it, and shut the box with a gentleness that signaled reverence rather than fear. He pressed the unscorched end of the scarf to the hollow below his throat as if testing whether breath could run steadier under a weight. The name came again, no louder, and wandered into the rafters. Eliza's fingers cooled around the post, her old impulse to fix what hands can reach. Soup, scrapes, seams rose and fell. This sorrow would not be mended by touch. It could be honored. She backed out, shoulders sliding the door, heel finding packed earth. She crossed to the kitchen, checked the child, added a split stick, tore a strip from a flour sack, washed it, and smoothed it near the stove, while she thought about words that could carry kindness without trespass. A small pencil sat on the shelf, whittled to a stub. She turned the cloth until the weave lay straight, then wrote in a clear hand, choosing simplicity because fancy speech often hides more than it helps. I see you carry weight no one else can lift. If there is a task these hands can take, so yours may rest. Set it where I can find it. No reply needed. She let the letters dry, folded the strip twice, so any message would not proclaim itself, and went back to the barn with a dipper of warm water for the mare, as her pretext. Caleb had moved to the far stall and now mended a strap with an awl, face composed, breath even, grief folded into the quiet competence he wore like a coat. The scarf lay on the cedar box, blue against pale wood, a river that had crossed flame. Eliza set the bucket down, murmured to the horse, and laid the folded strip by the lantern, far enough from the scarf to avoid presumption, near enough to be found. She did not look at him or ask questions shaped like sympathy. She lifted the dipper to the mare's muzzle, scratched the warm place behind an ear and left. Inside she gathered Samuel and moved through anchoring tasks, sweeping the threshold, skimming the pot, mending a cuff, straightening a chair leg that snagged her skirt. Afternoon thinned to a silvery shade. Caleb came in later with crusted snow along his boot tops, and a steadiness that looked earned rather than masked. He shook his coat outside, hung it slowly, washed at the basin and said nothing about the barn. Eliza said nothing about the note. He salted a path, trimmed a wick, repaired a hinge and listened while Stu sighed on the hob. When they sat he bowed his head a fraction and lifted his spoon. His eyes when they rose, held something less guarded, not open, not shut, like a door on a latch that will lift if asked. Samuel banged a wooden spoon and laughed. Caleb reached to still the clatter, then let it go, a smile passing quick as a swallow. Eliza kept to ordinary subjects, the fence by the cottonwoods, a fox print under the window, the kettle's lower note since the lid had worn. He answered in kind, voice even, words chosen for use. Later, when he stepped out to bank coals and she set the room to rights, she pictured the scarf again, imagined how cloth keeps scent after years, how flame marks differently than weather, how names spoken alone echo longer than any shout. Gratitude rose for the discipline practiced by instinct that morning. Silence given in the right hour can serve like balm. If you have ever noticed hurt, living behind a steady look and chose patience over pressure, remember that moment now, what it asked, and who you became because of it. Eliza banked the fire until it glowed like a heart cupped in ash, laid Samuel in his bunk and smoothed the blanket. Caleb returned smelling of hay and cold iron, nodded, and lifted the kettle to pour a bit of hot water into 2 cups. They stood at the table with steam rising between them and said nothing extravagant. Before turning in, he reached into his pocket and set a folded strip on the shelf near the Bible. She looked only long enough to see the cloth tied in a neat square. Her note no words appeared in its place. That absence, offered gently, said everything needed. Beyond the logs, winter talked to itself, and inside, 2 people carried what they must with a care that did not brood. Hold that memory and let it guide the way you stand near another person's storm, steady, available, saying nothing that steals air. El amanecer llegó con una quietud húmeda que pesaba sobre la pradera como una piel tibia. Eliza oyó el primer chasquido del hielo antes de ver el vapor levantarse de los montículos. Durante semanas la nieve había sido pared y techo. Ahora el aire traía olor a tierra abierta y los aleros goteaban sin pudor. Caleb ya estaba afuera, con la pala al hombro y los ojos midiendo la bajada hacia el arroyo. Samuel dormía junto al hogar, ajeno al cambio de tono que anunciaba deshielo. Eliza salió, sintió el barro ceder bajo las botas, y caminó hacia su pequeño jardín, ese cuadro protegido por paja donde había escondido semillas, cebollas jóvenes y menta. El primer balde del cielo cayó sin aviso. Una lengua marrón atravesó el cerco de paja y borró en segundos la geometría que tanto le había costado. El agua viene con fuerza, dijo Caleb sin alzar la voz. Abriré un canal. Eliza asintió y corrió a salvar la caja de lata que guardaba su tesoro de sobres. La levantó justo cuando el borde de madera se soltó, arrastrado por el chorro que llegó desde la ladera aún manchada de nieve. El olor cambió, ya no olía a humo sino a madera cruda, a hojas viejas, a invierno molido. Metió la mano en la cama que ayer había palmeado con esperanza y sacó un puñado de raíces blandas rotas, inútiles. Una punzada seca le subió al pecho. Caleb clavó la pala, abrió una zanja oblicua y desvió parte del torrente hacia la hondonada. Pero otra rama se arremolinó y corrió directa al cobertizo que Eliza había vuelto escuela. Las letras, dijo ella, y echó a correr. El agua golpeó la puerta como un hombro testarudo y entró con ella. El piso se volvió sopa, la pizarra se desprendió de los clavos y cayó boca abajo. La caja de cuadernos se abrió como pez, soltando papeles que se doblaron y flotaron hasta pegarse a la mesa. Eliza levantó el tablero e intentó rescatar tizas que se deshacían como azúcar. Apartó con el antebrazo una corriente que trajo un manojo de paja y un trozo de vidrio. Caleb llegó, hundió la pala bajo el banco grande, palanqueó y creó un remanso que bajó la furia un instante. Fuera, dijo. Saquemos lo pesado, después lo fino. Entre los dos arrastraron el banco hasta el granero y volvieron por la caja rota, la lámpara, el cajón de letras talladas, el mapa que ella había dibujado a mano. El chorro crecía, la ventana reventó con un súbito crujido, y una cuchillada de agua se metió por la abertura. Eliza tembló. Mírame, dijo Caleb. Cerca sin tocarla. Respira. Ella obedeció. El rumor se ordenó. Volvieron a mover cosas, tropezaron, se embarraron hasta la cintura. Cuando todo lo salvable estuvo en alto, Eliza quedó quieta frente a lo que había sido aula. Charcos lechosos, tizas reducidas a leche, letras lavadas de la pizarra, un rincón donde aún flotaba la huella de unas botas pequeñas. Salió tambaleando con las manos convertidas en palas de barro. Afuera la pradera se había tornado un mapa sin bordes. Surcos nuevos cruzaban el patio. El corral tragaba huellas. La ladera bajaba entera hacia el valle, gris y parda, como si el invierno se disolviera a propósito para probar paciencia. Caleb seguía cavando sin prisa falsa. Cada palada respondía a una lógica callada. Cortar un brazo del torrente, guiarlos hacia la zanja, proteger la base de la escuela con sacos de grano. Sube las semillas al altillo, indicó, y trae mantas para atrancar la puerta. Eliza obedeció con dedos torpes. Dejó a Samuel en el catre con una cucharada de sopa, subió, guardó la caja en alto, bajó con las mantas, empujó junto a Caleb contra la corriente que buscaba atajos. Sus faldas pesaban el doble, el barro chupaba tobillos. En el jardín quedó una planicie abollada donde antes había líneas. Clavó la mano, sacó un resto de raíz y no supo en qué rincón del mundo colocarlo. No es final, dijo Caleb. Es barro y el barro aprende. Hoy duele, respondió ella sincera. Aquí estoy, contestó él, y bastó. La lluvia aflojó, pero el deshielo se aceleró río arriba. Se oyó el rugido de placas rompiéndose bajo los abetos. El agua fatigada empozó en la zanja grande y comenzó a ceder. El cobertizo quedó herido. Puerta hinchada, techo marcado por líneas oscuras. Pared que respiraba. Eliza entró de nuevo y con paciencia tercamente útil enderezó lo que pudo. Levantó la pizarra, secó la lata pintada con trapo áspero. Colgó en una cuerda un abecedario manchado. Juntó dos pedazos firmes de tiza. Al salir, Caleb la llamó con la pala clavada como señal. Ven, dijo. Mira esto. En el borde del canal que acababa de abrir, sobre un terrón entero atrapado por el reflujo, había dos hojas mínimas verdes verdaderas. No barro pintado. Un brote. Eliza lo miró sin parpadear, con el pecho apretado por algo que no era llanto ni risa. Ponlo tú, dijo Caleb. Tienes mano ligera. Ella cavó con el dedo, alojó el terrón, apretó a los costados y dejó el pequeño tallo protegido por una curva de tierra. Se dio cuenta de que estaba respirando hondo por primera vez desde el primer golpe contra la puerta. El cielo tacaño abrió una gasa más clara hacia el oeste. El corral empezó a devolver la huella sin tragarla al instante. El patio dejó de ser espejo turbio, y se volvió camino torpe. Montana cambiaba de piel delante de ellos, nieve a barro, barro a for. Eliza y Caleb recogieron herramientas, ordenaron sacos, enderezaron un poste, cerraron la escuela con tranca y cuerda. Las manos dolían, los hombros ardían, el silencio pesaba menos. Samuel balbuceó desde la cabaña y ese sonido quebró la última rigidez. Eliza entró un momento, lo apretó contra el pecho dejando manchas pardas. Le besó la frente, y volvió afuera a mirar el brote que temblaba apenas. Mañana traeré arena del banco, dijo Caleb. Mezclamos, aireamos, y abrimos surcos nuevos. La escuela también, contestó ella. Tablas secas, clavos más largos. 2 pilares, él asintió. No prometieron cosechas, nombraron tareas. La tarde fue retirándose con pudor. El goteo en los aleros pasó de chorro a hilo. El barro, que se había sentido dueño del mundo, empezó a aceptar límites. Eliza levantó una tabla y la puso al sol flaco. Colgó el mapa en la cuerda. Sonrió al ver que el contorno del río seguía legible a pesar de la mancha. Caleb arregló la bisagra de la puerta con un clavo, que enderezó sobre una piedra y untó con grasa el cuero que se había encogido. Cuando por fin entraron, la cabaña olía a ropa mojada, sopa a madera cansada. Eliza calentó el guiso, sirvió tazones y se sentó con los codos en las rodillas, rendida pero todavía sostenida por una cuerda invisible. Caleb dejó las botas junto al fuego, colocó la pala contra la pared, y se lavó las manos en silencio. Comieron sin apuro. Afuera el arroyo siguió hablando. Menos furioso, más regular. Hoy enterramos lo perdido, dijo Eliza. Sin mirar la ventana. Mañana sembramos otra vez. Estoy contigo, respondió él. Ella sostuvo esa frase como si fuera una taza caliente entre dedos fríos. El viento cambió, trajo olor a piedra limpia. La noche tensó la superficie de los charcos, lo justo para que el patio guardara las marcas de todo lo que habían movido. Antes de dormir, Eliza salió un segundo a la puerta. El brote seguía allí, pequeño como un secreto que se niega a ser negado. Lo cubrió con una casita de ramas ligera. Respiró y volvió adentro. Si alguna vez viste dolor ajeno crecer bajo agua turbia, y elegiste sostenerlo frágil sin discursos, recuerda esa elección ahora. No hace falta decir más que estar, cavar, apuntalar, rescatar, volver a plantar. En la frontera no existe magia que devuelva lo arrasado. Existe la obstinación que vuelve a levantar sillas, mapas y surcos. Esa obstinación, compartida fue su refugio mientras la pradera cambiaba de un blanco cruel a un marrón que pronto permitiría hielo. Esa noche mientras Samuel respiraba parejo y la lámpara dibujaba un círculo de oro en el techo, Eliza supo que el agua se había llevado líneas, pero no el pulso, y cuando se miraron entendieron que la casa, la escuela y el jardín podían nacer otra vez desde un tallo minúsculo salvado del barro. La primavera entró sin fanfarrias. Primero como un olor húmedo que subió desde el arroyo y luego como un trazo de verde que amanecía cada día un poco más sobre los bordes del patio. Eliza salió con una azada corta y encontró la tierra todavía pesada, pero ya no hostil. El barro que semanas antes había querido tragarlo todo, ahora aceptaba surcos. A cada golpe de herramienta correspondía una respiración larga como si el suelo y ella se enseñaran paciencia mutuamente. En el umbral Samuel palmoteaba, fascinado por el sol líquido que se derramaba sobre sus dedos. Aprendía a alzarse desde la manta, a pasar de rodillas a equilibrio titubeante, a tambalearse con orgullo de potrillo. Caleb dejaba al lado el martillo, le ofrecía sus manos como dos troncos seguros y retrocedía un paso, luego otro, para invitarlo a avanzar. El niño daba 3 zancadas de juguete y caía riendo contra el pecho ancho que siempre llegaba a tiempo. Donde antes había sido silencio obstinado, ahora vivía una música baja, agua corriendo, pájaros que regresaban a los abetos, cucharas golpeando el borde del balde, voces vecinas que se acercaban con curiosidad franca. Eliza abrió la puerta como si ofreciera una hogaza recién horneada, dispuso bancos al sol, repartió pizarritas, y marcó en la pared una línea que sería frontera entre juego y estudio. Las niñas aprendieron a trazar su nombre con tiza firme, los gemelos midieron sombras con una cuerda para calcular la altura del álamo. Tomás copió a regañadientes la letra M porque le recordaba el arco doble de las montañas. Cuando el viento cambió todos entraron, y la escuela olió a lana calentada, madera nueva y promesa. Por la tarde Eliza regresaba al jardín y recogía pequeñas victorias. Una hoja que se desplegaba sin vergüenza, una lombriz que asomaba como hilo vivo, un brote que había resistido otra helada tímida. Plantó habas, estiró un túnel de arcos cubiertos con tela para guardar calor nocturno, y clavó en la esquina más protegida un poste donde ató una campanita hecha con una taza abollada. Su sonido ligero llamaría a clase. No hacía discursos, aparecía cerca con las palmas abiertas y ofrecía equilibrio sin ordenar. Entre ambos sin necesidad de declarar nada, la vida tomó un ritmo de taller y huerto. Amanecían con olor a café, seguían con herramientas ordenadas, voz medida y trabajo compartido. El invierno dejó de ocupar la cabeza entera y se volvió un recuerdo que enseñaba a prepararse. Eliza escribía listas con letras de maestra, sembrar zanahorias, preparar pizarra, leer historias a los pequeños, revisar techos, preparar jarabe de menta para la tos. Cada tarea tachada parecía un peldaño hacia una claridad más ancha. La comunidad, atraída por esa constancia, comenzó a llegar sin formalidades. Se quedó a escuchar cómo Samuel emitía una sílaba que todos juraron que decía pa, lo cual provocó una risa franca en Caleb que nadie había oído antes. Aquella carcajada breve, limpia, quedó flotando en la madera como un perfume invisible. Eliza la guardó con cuidado en el mismo cajón donde conservaba semillas raras. Con el avance del calendario, los brotes se volvieron plantas, aparecieron tallos firmes, flores pequeñas, un verde más oscuro que anunciaba raíz sana. La campanita sonó cada mañana y la escuela cobró pulso. Primero repasaban letras, después numeraban objetos del patio. Luego salían a dibujar el cielo y el perfil lejano de la sierra. Eliza usaba cuentos para explicar medidas y canciones para fijar reglas. Si el viento soplaba demasiado fuerte, convertía la ráfaga en ejemplo de fuerza. Si se hacía calma, aprovechaba para practicar lectura en voz baja. Caleb pasaba por la puerta, dejaba una caja con puntillas o una madera pulida para mapas, y seguía su ronda. Sin embargo, cada vez que Samuel soltaba una mano y ganaba medio metro, suspendía cualquier labor y aplaudía con una alegría que no pretendía esconder. El niño de mejillas sonrosadas recorría el suelo como si la cabaña hubiera sido construida solo para ese juego. Aprendió a buscar piedras lisas junto al arroyo, a tocar la sombra de su padre en la pared como si fuera un animal tímido, a señalar pájaros por su canto. Al caer la tarde Eliza regaba el huerto con una regadera de lata, y hablaba en voz baja con las plantas, agradeciendo a cada una su cabecera. Una noche de luna generosa organizaron una lectura afuera, las niñas trajeron mantas, los gemelos una lámpara de aceite. Tomás apareció con un frasco donde brillaban luciérnagas. Eliza contó una historia de viaje y amparo, y notó sin cambiar la voz que Caleb escuchaba desde la sombra del porche con Samuel dormido en el hombro. No se acercó, bastó su presencia. Los allí reunidos compartieron sopa, pan, risas, y esa quietud que aparece cuando nadie tiene prisa por irse. Al día siguiente, la escuela pidió un mapa nuevo. Caleb cortó una tabla liviana, la lijó hasta volverla a seda, y Lisa dibujó ríos, valles, pasos, pueblos mínimos. Los chicos aprendieron a decir aguas arriba y aguas abajo, a entender por qué el deshielo manda noticias antes de llegar, a medir la distancia entre el jardín y el molino viejo usando pasos iguales. Semanas después, una lluvia templada cayó sin violencia, y hubo perfume de tierra dulce. El huerto celebró a su modo, menta más frondosa, cebollas que asomaron como dedos, una hilera de flores atrayendo abejas gordas. Samuel, experto ya en equilibrarse, quiso correr. Caleb lo siguió con una soga floja a modo de juego y le enseñó a girar en círculos sin marearse. Después practicaron una ceremonia que el niño adoraba, caminar desde el hogar hasta el poste de la campanita y tocarla con un dedo serio, como si estuviera inaugurando otra temporada. Eliza, viéndolos, sintió que la cabaña tenía ahora latido propio. El aire guardaba ecos de niñez, de trabajo bien hecho de adultos que elegían hablar bajo para dejar espacio a la risa. Sin declaraciones la confianza se instaló. En la pared aparecieron dibujos de bisontes azules, soles con pestañas, casas con techos. En la mesa una caja con tizas de colores recordaba que la vida permite matices. Bajo el alero colgaron un cordel con palabras nuevas: brotar, sostener, sumar, compartir, cuidar. Cada término se transformó en hábito. La tarde en que Eliza encontró la primera flor de caléndula abierta, llevó el pétalo a la escuela y explicó cómo una planta sencilla puede proteger a otra. Ruth le regaló un delantal con bolsillos. Los gemelos construyeron un comedero para pájaros. Tomás, conquistado por la letra, anunció que quería escribir historias de búfalo. Cuando el sol alargó sombras y las noches ya no dolieron, organizaron una jornada de intercambio. Harina por lecciones, leña por lectura, semillas por canciones. Todo llegó a su lugar con una naturalidad que parece milagro aunque nazca de manos constantes. La casa perdió el gesto de fortín y tomó forma de plaza chica. Cada día nació con su faena, su aprendizaje, su mínima celebración. Y en ese ritmo tejido de gestos concretos, Eliza y Caleb descubrieron que no hacía falta decir promesas para cumplirlas. Bastaba con aparecer, escuchar, sostener y agradecer. La pradera, ya libre de hielos, se convirtió en compañera confiable, y el aula, compacta y luminosa, en un faro que convocaba a quien necesitara horizonte, palabra, o par de manos listas para ayudar sin preguntar demasiado. The letter arrived on a bright, wind-brushed afternoon, when the mint sent a clean fragrance through the open window and the schoolhouse bell chimed once. Because Samuel's fingers could not resist the little clapper. Eliza found the envelope beneath the flour tin beside a bundle of nails Caleb had left after mending the bench. The seal bore a county crest and the formal script of someone who believed in tidy ledgers and stamped approvals. She brushed soil from her palms, slit the flap with the back of a paring knife and unfolded paper that smelled faintly of ink and starch. It was an offer from the superintendent in Red Willow, a town 2 days' ride along the river. A position at the primary school after midsummer, wages paid monthly, a room at the boarding house at reduced cost, coal in winter, a standing desk, chalk by the crate and shelves with readers enough for every child. The words promised stability like a well-laid road. Her name looked steady at the top, Miss Eliza Thornton, followed by phrases that eased old fears: reliable, capable, recommended by travelers who had heard of a frontier school where children measured shadows and learned to breathe through storms. She read it twice, then a third time. Across the yard, Caleb showed Samuel how to stand at the fence. The boy's fingers curled over warm rails while a roan horse nosed his sleeve. The sight tugged her in 2 directions at once, toward security offered by someone she had never met, and toward a life stitched day by day with mended hinges, early coffee and the steady grammar of kindness. She carried the letter to the schoolhouse, a sun-bleached room that still bore faint stains along its lower boards from the flood. Light fell through the window onto maps Caleb had mounted that spring, the newest showing a river braided with blue thread where children had glued yarn to remember how water divides and reunites. Her slate held yesterday's words: patience, measure. She pictured the road to Red Willow rails singing in heat, storefronts with straight porches, a bell that rang on time, a salary that arrived in envelopes without delay, and then pictured an empty space at the cabin table and the missing tap of Samuel's afternoon hand on the bell. Her chest tightened. She folded the letter and went back to the house. By the entry Caleb had carved a single word months ago, a quiet mark at knee height where only someone sweeping would notice home. She traced the grooves, stood and read the letter again by the hearth, because fairness required another look. The terms were sensible. The paper asked only for labor and attendance. It did not mention fog in the valley at dawn or a child's fist catching her dress when balance failed or the way Caleb's breath deepened when Samuel slept on his shoulder. It did not know the smell of mint syrup beside beans or the sound of neighbors after lessons or the shape of a scar that grief had turned into gentleness. She set the page on the mantel and went outside. Caleb stood at the block, splitting kindling into slivers while Samuel toddled toward him in steps. "A letter," she said. He waited. She read the offer without shading it. At the shelves with readers his glance flicked toward the schoolhouse. When she finished, she was quiet. "It's a good letter," he said. "It is," she answered. "Would you want it?" he asked. "If the rest of life were a smooth table." "If everything were smooth," she said, "children would learn less." Samuel lifted his arm. Caleb crouched, offered hands like posts, and the boy walked the bridge, laughing when he reached the harbor of a steady chest. Eliza felt something rise. She spent the afternoon working beside the choice, not inside it, harvesting mint, airing books, oiling the bell clapper, repairing a collar torn during tag. Toward evening, clouds stacked over the western ridge. Neighbors arrived with eggs, a loaf and 2 pencils. She thought of Red Willow again, of a blackboard that never stained and a salary that could buy cloth without counting. Choose security and travel away, or choose presence and accept a ledger that never quite balances. After supper, the cabin dimmed to ember light. Eliza bathed Samuel, settled him on a quilt with a wooden horse, and set the letter on the table where moonlight found it. The carved word by the door seemed to draw a faint line from threshold to table, as if strings ran between marks and breadth. She weighed the paper the way a baker weighs flour, not by number but by feel. She looked at Caleb mending a strap with calm attention and at the child pushing the horse in serious circles. The room smelled of pine and soap. She understood then that the job would give safety, but distance would require payment every hour. The school here had started with a flood and grown among neighbors whose boots left honest prints at the door. She took the iron from the hook, lifted the stove lid and let coals show their orange cores. Paper hissed when heat found it. She held the letter over flame, steady, not in anger but in thanks for what it revealed by asking. Edges browned and curled, the crest brightened, then thinned to ash. She fed the pieces until the offer became a drift that glittered and collapsed. Behind her Samuel laughed at nothing but balance and breath. Caleb looked up after she closed the lid. Understanding passed across his face like light when clouds thin. He did not say good or brave. He set the strap aside and stood with her in the quiet that follows a firm choosing. Outside, frogs started along the creek and the bell, caught by a gust, tapped once as if to bless the room. Eliza tucked the empty envelope into the tinderbox for morning and felt relief ripple through her like cool water. She wrote a single word on the slate in neat strokes, home, and propped it by the door so sunlight would find it first. If you have ever stood where the safe path was paved and the tender one led toward people you love, think back to the day you chose the road that let your heart breathe. Remember what you kept, what you released, and who you became because you stayed where your name felt whole. Night settled clean and near. A dark bowl tipped over the cottonwoods while a westerly breathed through mint and damp earth. She stepped onto the threshold and saw the yard silvered, the fence a simple line, the schoolhouse squared against the star. Footprints stitched the ground from door to bell to garden, a small map of vows kept without ceremony. Tomorrow would ask for lessons on fractions and a hinge repaired and beans weeded between rows. Tomorrow would be enough. She closed the door gently so the slate would not fall, banked the fire to a red heart and lay down with Samuel's soft breath near her ear. Across the room Caleb exhaled, long and even, a sound of arrival rather than restlessness, and the house received them both. Morning widened like a ribbon over the cottonwoods, and the prairie answered with soft light, not the hard glare of winter, but a tender shimmer that made every fence post look newly set. Eliza opened the schoolhouse door, and the bell gave one bright tap because Samuel's inquisitive hand loved to test its tongue. Children arrived in pairs, boots dusted with pollen instead of frost, hats tilted, cheeks warmed by a breeze that smelled of creek water and sun on pine. Caleb had mended the hinge at dawn. The door swung easily, a quiet promise that little things would hold. Lessons began with counting birds on the fence and tracing the curve of the river on the map. Caleb had smoothed and framed. Voices rose, fell, laughed and gathered again, a chorus stitched by patience. Between sums and letters, Eliza glanced through the window toward the garden where beans lifted their narrow flags, mint breathed bright, and volunteer poppies sparked like scattered embers along the path. Samuel tottered from table to doorway, a wooden horse in one fist, the other lifted toward Caleb whenever courage outran balance. Caleb knelt, hands ready, saying nothing, letting the boy measure distance and return, the way a heart learns a room. Neighbors left eggs, nails, wildflower cuttings, even a spare reader with corners softened by dozens of careful thumbs. By midday the meadow hummed, bees combed the clover, a meadowlark rang from the fence post, and the sky wore that early summer blue that feels freshly laundered. Eliza dismissed the class to sketch outside, watched crayons and bits of chalk translate the day into bright squares, and felt the sort of fullness that does not overflow. It settles, then deepens. Caleb set a plank across two sawhorses to build a low shelf for slates. Hair tumbled from under his hat, jaw shadowed, eyes steady as a level. When he looked up, Eliza looked back, neither of them speaking, their exchange as unadorned as the tools on the plank, and just as Samuel aimed for the bell rope, missed, laughed, tried again and reached Caleb's knee by accident, which suited him fine. The knee was a sturdy harbor. Afternoon slipped golden and deliberate. The schoolhouse smelled of wood shavings, chalk and bread cooling on a towel. Wildflowers freckled the far slope, looping paintbrush and shy prairie smoke, while the creek rode a silver line through new grass. Eliza stacked readers, brushed the board clean and hung a garland the children had braided from dandelion stems. It slouched, cheerful as a grin. She stepped onto the threshold and saw Caleb lift Samuel high, until the child squealed, then set him on the ground and guided two wobbly steps with one finger beneath a small palm. Love sat in that gesture like a stone in the center of a river, quiet, shaping the current without announcing itself. Neighbors ambled back with news of a calf, a question about seed, a song half learned and gladly finished by a chorus of three. Eliza poured mint tea, shared bread with honey, and traded stories of floods, fences and small victory. When someone thanked her for keeping the school alive, she answered that a place stands when many hands hold it. Then she glanced at Caleb and found his mouth twitched like a secret agreement. Later, as shadows lengthened, she walked the garden and pinched blossoms to coax the plants toward fruit. Caleb followed the fence line, checking ties, then joined her at the beams. They stood hip to hip, not touching, looking down at the tidy climb and felt the same lightness move through them, a recognition that two steady lives can braid into one without ceremony. Samuel's voice piped from the steps, and both turned at once. Their eyes met, and something quiet passed between them, an accord drawn from months of shared labor, grief respected, and joy allowed. No pledge spoken, no plan sketched in ink, only the practiced habit of showing up, which is how real vows are written. Night began as a blue wash over the pasture. Fireflies sparked along the creek. A breeze slipped down from the ridge, and brought the future's scent, cut hay, sun-warmed saddle, bread at dawn, lessons that would outlast the boards they were written on. Eliza closed the shutters of the schoolhouse, lifted the latch on the cabin window, and caught Caleb's reflection beside hers in the darkening glass. Samuel drooped against her shoulder, heavy with the good fatigue of practice. Caleb reached to take him, their fingers brushed, and a bright simple heat traveled from touch to chest. They did not remark on it, they did not need to. The cabin itself seemed to breathe, content with the traffic of the day. On the wall by the door, the word Caleb had carved months ago still caught the lamplight home, and the letters looked deeper now, burnished by countless passes of cloth in hand. Eliza traced the groove as she passed, a habit and a blessing. She set Samuel down, stirred the stew, and pushed an extra bowl across the table just as Caleb came in. He removed his hat, smiled without polish, sat and ladled supper for all three. They ate while the window framed dusk like a paint. The small clatter of spoons knew its place, and kept the moment company without intruding. Afterwards the boy demanded another try at walking. Caleb obliged, patient as water shaping stone, while Eliza tidied pans and hummed an old tune whose words had worn away yet still held meaning. Outside, coyotes tuned themselves far off, and no one worried. The prairie had softened under spring's hand, even the fence wires seemed to lie easier. Later neighbors drifted by with children eager for stories. The schoolhouse lantern threw a calm circle on the packed earth. Eliza read about ships and stars. Caleb sketched a compass rose on thin pine and showed how north can be found even when cloud denies the sky. Samuel slept against Eliza's lap through the last page, thumb tucked, breath sweet as warmed milk. When families left, they did so slowly, reluctant to puncture the evening's peace. Then it was only the three of them again, the fire low, the bell still, the yard silvered by a patient moon. Eliza stood with Caleb on the threshold, shoulder to shoulder, each seeing what the other saw. A garden ready to offer, a schoolhouse sturdy, a creek content, a road that could lead away yet did not call. Words rose and broke inside her, not because they were heavy but because stillness said them better. He looked down at her hand on the door frame and set his palm beside it, not covering, simply aligning, a quiet statement that this life belonged to both. Samuel stirred, murmured something that sounded like a greeting to the dark, and settled again. Eliza turned, lifted the boy, and swayed once the way mothers do in rooms that have learned their names. Caleb banked the stove and left a line of kindling dry for morning. The lamplight thinned until it pooled under the glass like spilled gold. Their gazes met over the flame and held, no rush, no performance, two steady fires recognizing kin. They remembered the flood, the scarf, the note laid without a demand, the letter burned to ash, the sprouts saved, the bell rung by a determined finger. Everything that mattered lived here now, not as trophies but as habits. Eliza blew out the lamp, and the cabin's quiet grew rich. Crickets took the first watch, the creek kept the second. Before sleep she spoke one sentence into the dark, almost playful, almost solemn. "We'll make a good morning of it." Caleb answered from his bunk with a sound that was not quite a laugh, not quite a prayer, more like the release of a held breath. At dawn the promise proved itself again. Birds made a wheel above the cottonwoods. Dew jeweled the grass. Eliza lit the stove. Caleb fetched water. Samuel thumped the bell and crowed, and the day unfolded with the surety of practiced kindness. Wild flowers nodded as if to approve. The schoolhouse filled with the rustle of pages, and the low thunder of tiny concentration. Between problems and stories, Eliza and Caleb crossed glances that landed like a hand to the shoulder. "I'm here, I see you, carry on." The prairie answered with a long satisfied breath. And if this life had a banner it would show not triumph but steadiness. Meals shared, tools returned, lessons kept, footsteps side by side from door to garden to gate. Home had been carved once, now it was lived in 100 unremarked motions that drew a circle around three people, and invited the valley to warm its hands at the edge. If this story of love and resilience moved you, give it a thumbs up, subscribe and join us at Frontier Hearts for weekly tales of courage and connection. Turn on the bell to never miss a story where hearts find home in the wild.